When I came into Goldman, first of all, I had 13 interviews, which is crazy. Most people that I talk to that I've said this to that have worked at Goldman, that's kind of norm. You have a lot of interviews, you're talking to a lot of people. There are people you're talking to who are sort of giving you the what's the square root of pi question, and then there are people who are trying to converse and see how you're going to fit on the team. And so it's a really wide-ranging group of folks that you interview with. So Goldman Sachs had purchased Spear, Leeds & Kellogg, and the cultures between Spear, Leeds & Kellogg and Goldman could not have been more different. Spear, Leeds & Kellogg, very scrappy, very aggressive. They had done it through finding niches and really leaning into those niches. They were purchased by Goldman Sachs, and Goldman, very white shoe, very buttoned up. Everyone went to an Ivy League school, and the cultures clashed quite a bit. And so when I first came in, I was really put into a lot of rooms as Switzerland.
In a corporate world where all employees have great leaders with no egos that create fun cultures where people can do their best work, the employees and companies thrive while doing great things for the customers, themselves, and each other.
Well, we know that rarely happens. I'm Jeff Palacio. I have been a leader for over 40 years for every t-shirt size company, from small 16 employees to extra large over 1 million. Please join me while I interview outstanding leaders that will share stories of great leadership and not so great. It will help you become a better leader while poking fun at all the crazy shit that happens in corporate America.
Hi, I'm Joe Deshawn, and welcome to The Corporate Couch with Jeff Palacio. Today's episode is brought to you by Palacio and Partners, providing turnkey podcast creation, hosting, production, promotion, and related creative resources for you and your business. Today, Jeff is interviewing Shari Noonan. Shari is the co-founder and CEO of Rialto Markets, a FINRA-registered broker-dealer and SEC-registered alternative trading system built to bring institutional-grade infrastructure to private capital markets. She has more than 25 years of experience at Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and Instinet. She has helped shape the electronification of public equity markets and is applying that same innovative mindset to private markets, helping expand access to capital through regulated platforms for primary issuance, secondary trading, transfer agency, and digital securities. Shari holds a BS in accounting from Marquette University and an MBA from Columbia Business School. She has received multiple industry honors, including the Marquette University College of Business Administration Entrepreneur Award and the Markets Media Choice Instinet Positive Change Visionary Award. You can learn more about Shari at rialtomarkets.com. Let's listen as Jeff talks to Shari.
Very excited to talk to you. You were introduced by a good friend of mine, Jeff Zarice, his wife Susan, as part of your team, I believe. So, very excited to talk to you. You know, you're the CEO of Rialto Markets and co-founder, but based on our chat when we met via Zoom, I think last week, it's almost like you have a reinvention through chaos kind of story. So, we're going to get into that, but let's talk about some fun stuff first. Even people know you fairly well. Shari, what one thing would surprise them about you?
I think probably one of the things that would surprise them the most is when I was younger, I grew up in the Midwest. So I do have a Midwestern vibe about me, but I grew up in the Midwest and I spent most of my summers in Lake of the Ozarks. But back in the day that Lake of the Ozarks did not seem as it did for people who know it now in the Midwest, who go down there now, or who saw the show Ozark. It really was neither one of those those places. It was a really lovely place to disconnect. We didn't have a TV or a phone, and we'd spent every summer there from the time I was 5 until I graduated from college. So really enjoyable to disconnect over the summers, and read the entire library at Lake of the Ozarks. So it was a really lovely way to grow up.
What were some of your favorite books that you were reading at the time?
Well, I was a child, so I basically read the entire children's section
Okay.
Of
Well, you said through college, so were you partying a lot of Lake of the Ozarks because it's a very partying type atmosphere there.
It's funny, and I have to laugh. So I did have a few years, but honestly, every year I was saving up to go back to college, and then my last year I was moving to New York, and so I was trying to save up as much money as possible because New York is expensive, and I didn't know anyone in New York, and so I worked two jobs. So I worked as a waitress at night, and then during the day I worked in retail, and I had 3 days off the whole summer. And there was interesting, funny story. There was something in the newspaper. Back then you found a job through the newspapers, and the newspaper was hiring for a baker from 4 to 8 a.m. And in my young mind, I thought, well, I can pick up this job to have a third shift and make a little bit more money. And my mother had to put the kibosh on that. She said, you're not going to get a third job. You're going to be fine with the two jobs. But I worked as a waitress at Eddie's Sports Bar and worked at retail during the day. And really was able to save up and then move off to New York City, which was a fun adventure.
I'm sure it was. I don't know if it's still around, but I know there was a famous or infamous bar there called Dick's Halfway Inn.
That's right.
Yeah,
There's
great
also
name.
the Party Cove. Now,
Yeah.
I was not as familiar with the Party Cove. However,
Yeah.
I do have acquaintances that were.
Yeah. What was your favorite summer job there?
I loved all of my jobs. I would say waiting tables, honestly.
Yeah.
And my family was a little surprised because I'm not known for being that patient. And so they were surprised that I enjoyed waiting tables, but it was a very there was a movement to it. Things would get the time would go very quickly, one, and there was sort of a rhythm to it in terms of each of the tables and having conversations and I really enjoyed that. And every night was different. So every night you would have a different type of customer that was in. Some nights there would be boxing matches, so you'd have a bunch of bikers in. Another night you would have, the regular tourists in. So I enjoyed that, and I also knew, everyone would leave. So while I wasn't normally a patient person growing up, I learned patience, but also knew that I was interacting with these folks for a few hours at the most, and the money was phenomenal. So you can make a really good living if that's your summer job, not if that's your year-round job. What I learned is a lot of people that I worked
not
with,
that much money in January.
That's right. A lot of people I worked with, unfortunately, those 3 months needed to sustain them for the whole year. And that was, really unfortunate. But it was good if it was your summer job.
What was your biggest tip? You said you make great money. Do you remember your biggest tip?
Yes. So August Bush actually came in, Budweiser. And,
oh, yeah. Very familiar with him and his product.
Yeah. I think he just passed, actually.
Yeah, right.
But my brother-in-law worked for Anheuser-Busch for a number of years and would, down at Lake of the Ozarks, would actually sort of, be his, not chaperone, but would, be with him when he would come down to the Lake of the Ozarks. And so they came into the restaurant. I think he left me, they had a couple of beers, and I think he left me $100 tip, which obviously got my attention. But it did not, so that was my biggest tip. But it was obviously from someone that was outsized. I will say the best tippers are bikers, in my experience.
Motorcycle people, not
exactly.
people on a
motorcycle. Yeah, motorcycle bikers. And I think it was, we would just have good conversations, and they were very, very good tips. Yeah.
Yeah, very nice. Very nice. What lessons did you learn from waiting tables and being a server that you carried on into your entrepreneurial experiences?
I would definitely say patience, as well as being able to manage a lot of different things at the same time.
Yeah.
And I did have an experience. I had one table walk out on me. They ate and ran. And
Dine and dash.
Dine and dash. And back in those days, actually, the restaurant took it out of your tips. So I worked double shifts on Fridays and Saturdays. And so I basically made no tips that day because they took it out of the tips that I made. And that was a very good lesson in terms of keeping your eye on things and not necessarily. I kept saying, well, they're all in the bathroom. They weren't
Right.
all in the bathroom. And so, I definitely became much more aware of my surroundings after that.
Besides reading, what else did you do for fun growing up?
I mean, swimming. I was in the lake all the time. We were outside pretty much the entire time. And actually, I did leave this out. My dad bought it was one step above camping, but it was a resort. It was 5 cabins total. And so it was a fishing resort that was built in the 1930s. And so it was these rock cabins, and every week, it was amazing because every week we would have the same people come down during the summer. So, the first week of June, this family would come down, and it was the same schedule nearly every year. And so I cleaned cabins, and at night we would all come down to the main area that was gathering, and everyone would be sitting, and we'd have a big barbecue. And it was just really lovely because it was sort of like my entire summer was just, a rotation of family friends that would be coming down and visiting.
Yeah, there, yeah.
Yeah, it was quite a lovely way to grow up.
Yeah. We talked about it when we first met. So you grew up in Kansas City, North Kansas City, Parkville, I believe, and went to St. Pius High School. So I had to bring this up because I know it's a high concentration of people of Italian descent, and I think you said since you were blonde and you felt like a fish out of water, but did that experience help you read rooms better as you grew up because you were kind of hanging out with, different heritage? And
I'll say that, a couple of things. One, because I was 5'8" and blonde, I definitely stuck out. But there was a misperception that a lot of the coaches had that I would be athletic, and I put that to rest quite quickly. So they, a lot of the coaches, and so it was one of my first experiences of people saying, "No, you really can do this," and I had to show them that indeed I was not a track star or a basketball star.
Yes.
But I would say in terms of the, Italian American, my classmates, I really enjoyed getting to know the Sunday dinners and really the family, these large families that all came together. I come from a very small family. I've got, one sister, and so it was really quite heartwarming to be around all of these folks. But it definitely was one of my first experiences where, different, not in a massive way. I wasn't going to another country, but it was very culturally different to how I grew up. And I loved all of my time at St. Pius, though. It was really a great education, great experience, and then led me to Marquette University, which was also absolutely fantastic. And I still work with Marquette to this day.
Yeah,
really provided me with that kind of opportunity.
what was the appeal to go from Parkville to Marquette?
So really I was looking for something out of state. I wanted to go outside of Missouri. I wanted to, spread my wings, and Marquette was very friendly. So I would say, it's a Jesuit university. It's in the middle of Milwaukee. Back then Milwaukee was going through a transition, but it's a beautiful, mid-size city. That was very comfortable for me. It was very comfortable for me, and it was also just the people were so friendly and so inviting, whereas a lot of the other colleges I went and visited, I just felt it was very standoffish, and I didn't feel as comfortable, or it was very large. There were massive campuses that I just didn't feel comfortable on. So that's really what drew me to Marquette. Milwaukee's obviously freezing. So that was, Kansas City gets cold too, but Milwaukee has a different level of cold.
Yes.
And so that was something that I had to, get used to, but I absolutely loved my time there. And like I said, the biggest thing that really resonated with me was how the university worked with me. I had maybe unusual goals to go overseas and to have all of these types of experiences that weren't sort of in your normal 4-year program. And my freshman year, I was able to go to Turkey for a conference, and Marquette helped fund that. And then my sophomore year, I went to France and lived in France for 6 months. And then my first senior year, I went to Poland and lived in Poland and worked for the first telecom company that was started, Centratel, in Poland. And all of those experiences were really curated for me by Marquette. And that's, really something that I feel is very different than your normal, you're a number in a university and you sort of go through the paces, you have these massive lecture halls. It's a very different experience.
You went to Poland right after or shortly after the Berlin Wall came down. What was that whole experience like? And I know you didn't know what Poland was like before the wall, but talk about the experience.
It was really amazing. I mean, when I went to France, I was part of a student program, right? Your typical spend a semester overseas. I lived in Strasbourg. It was fantastic, but you're around a lot of other American students. And so I did, learn French a lot better and really immerse myself. However, the objective is really more about travel and, to see Europe and to have that experience. When I went to Poland, it was really fascinating because a few years later, and I hadn't really digested the enormity of what was going over there from a geopolitical perspective. And also there were a lot of Americans coming in that were either of Polish descent or people trying to come in and, this was going to be the new, we're going to make millions, right, off of this new frontier market. And so, as you can imagine, the Polish folks that had been there their entire lives were sort of not thrilled that a ton of people were descending upon Poland and trying to, change things and shift things. I went in somewhat naively, probably, thinking, okay, we're going to launch the first cellular phone company in the country. This is going to be amazing. We'll, leapfrog. So instead of the old infrastructure of, the wires that when it rains, you can't talk on the telephone when it would rain. It would flood and phones would stop working. We're going to leapfrog that technology and we're going to, really change things for the better. And, I got there and I worked for the CFO and realized they were charging an insane amount. It was $2,500 to get a phone. This is in the 90s, and 50 cents a minute. And so I really learned, okay, one, when you're super early deploying something, there's a lot of infrastructure that's built that needs to be recouped. And two, it was a monopoly at the time. And so it was the only cell phone company that was allowed that had a license for a certain number of years. And so it really affected the pricing. And so therefore really affected the actual applicability and the ability for people to use this new technology. And so that was really my first experience, one, on that side, but two, being in this culture where it was very different. A few things I remember. One, I had a really hard time getting an apartment. I was early 20s and, an American woman in their early 20s, single, they really didn't know what to do with me. And so I had a really hard time actually renting an apartment. I finally got an apartment, but my landlady would just show up. And so some nights I would come home and she would just be sitting at the kitchen table. And I didn't speak much Polish and she didn't speak any English, but I think she just wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything crazy in her apartment. So that was a really interesting experience that I had, as well as, other just cultural. I really learned that culturally things were very different, especially when you're working there and you're not sort of as a student traveling, you're not as immersed in day-to-day life. So that was, every month I had to take a little coupon. They had a book and you had to pay a tax on your TV. And so I had to go to the post office with this coupon on a certain day of the month and pay $1 or something to have a TV. But
Really?
There were some really interesting cultural, and also if you were older, you could skip in line. So you could go in front of younger people.
Yeah, so you were always last in line.
So, and I would be like, I'm on my lunch break and I have to pay this tax. What is going on? This is crazy. That was my American mind. So it was a really fascinating first experience of me being in a very different culture and not really at the time thinking too much about it. I very much went into it as this will be interesting and a new experience, but sort of understanding a lot of those differences and being American on top of it, which I think, sometimes we've got this subgroups within America, but I think being a fish out of water like that was fascinating.
That is phenomenal. I think you graduated Marquette with both an accounting and international business major emphasis. Talk about your accounting career, because you told me a funny story about your accounting degree.
Well, I became an accounting out of spite, an accounting major out of spite. So the first weed out class, the professor came up to me after our first or second exam and just said, you should drop this major and become a communications major. And that really didn't sit well with me. And so I ended up not only, I think I got a B in that class, but, passing that class, but I ended up insistent that I was going to major in accounting after that point. And I did major in accounting. And I think it taught me a lot of really great skills from a business perspective. I won't say my first job was as an auditor, and did not love that experience. I felt it was very, prescriptive in terms of their rules and things that you follow. So very quickly wanted to branch out from being an auditor. But I did graduate with an accounting degree, not necessarily because it was something that I loved, but really because I knew I could get a job. It was the mid-90s, and the economy wasn't great. And I knew I could get a job, and I, wanted to prove a professor wrong. And I can't even remember the professor's name, which is kind of funny.
So Shari, do you think spite is underrated as a fuel then?
It is. Yes,
funny.
I think it is.
Yeah, but you must have done well, because you work for whatever it was, Big Six at the time. So you had to do well. They don't take anyone, right?
Well, I was really fortunate. I was able to get a job in the New York office of KPMG, and actually started in manufacture, retail, and distribution, and was pulled out of training to go to a client in Wytheville, West Virginia. So a lot of clients that people didn't want to go see, they would pull folks out and put them on the job. So I spent a lot of time in, Queens, in factories, doing audits. But then I had a lucky break. During college, I worked at Strong Capital Management, which was a mutual fund, and really enjoyed that. I worked midnight to 8 while I was at Marquette. And so someone found out that I had financial services background, and there was a staffing shortage. So they moved me over to the financial services division. And from there, I was able to move into consulting. And I absolutely loved consulting. I loved everything about it. You would basically go into all of these companies and they would say, here are all of our problems. You would see the operations of various different companies rather than just having one sample set to sort of learn from. And I loved it. But after 4 years, you sort of, if you're successful, you end up getting put on the same projects over and over again. And so, after getting on a few of the same projects, I thought, I'm not growing to the same extent. And that's when I interviewed with a company called Instinet. It was one of the first electronic trading firms, and my family was terrified I was going to a startup. It was 99 at the time, in 1999. They were worried that I was getting pulled into the .com boom, but it actually had been around since the late 60s, early 70s. And I went to work there, and absolutely the culture at Instinet was so fascinating because it was a lot of folks that weren't from traditional finance, more liberal arts backgrounds, but that really were passionate about the shift that was just starting to happen in Wall Street, where things were moving from the floors of the New York Stock Exchange into, electronic trading, computers, which sounds crazy now. But back then it was, a very slow, very difficult and challenging process because workflows are very hard to change, and people's behaviors are very hard to change at scale. So we were really dealing with two types of changes. One was market structure change. So the rules, right? The rules that said everything has to go to NASDAQ or everything has to go to the New York Stock Exchange, and changing those rules to say, the orders need to go to the best place where the best price is. And then changing people's behaviors, which is
Right.
almost harder than changing the rules. And so it was really, I was able to be on the ground floor of that and experience that even more so because I was in the market structure group that worked on what was going on in market structure and how that would affect our business and how we could benefit from changes in market structure. So that was my first job and led me to Goldman. So in the early 2000s, all of the big banks said, I guess this is happening. And so they all started buying these platforms that they needed to integrate. And a lot of them didn't have the expertise in-house. So I was hired to help integrate not just the technology, but really the business and the people and how does all
Right.
of that shift. So it was, again, I was really fortunate that I was able to be in a very seismic shift within financial services, within capital markets at the time that it was moving, and could see the
Right.
changes and could see people, moving from paper tickets. You used to, when you would get an order on a trading desk, you would, get a phone call. First of all, you would, timestamp it. We had these clocks, and you would timestamp the ticket, and then you would write, buy 100 shares of IBM, and you would start working the order. You would then pick up the phone and call the specialist on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And so you think about that to, today you go on an app and you buy it within, 10 seconds, 5 seconds.
Right.
And
Right.
if you think about how things happen today with public securities, you can buy a share of IBM in 5 or 10 seconds. But really, until recently, if you love something in private markets, and I'll make it a little more relatable, if you loved a band or a film or some type of investment that really reflected electric vehicle company, something that reflected your values, your taste, something that you really are passionate about, you really weren't able, there was no door to knock on, right? There was no way to get into that type of investment. But that's really what we're building today at Rialto Markets through the ability to invest in private markets, which is really exciting because I saw it in public markets and I saw it change. And now we're really fortunate that we're able to be there for the private shift.
We'll talk a lot more about Rialto Markets, where you were the co-founder and CEO now. But going to Goldman, wasn't there was there any big surprises? Like, oh my God, this is a machine. That, as well as I think you talked about, they said, oh, you're coming over as a lateral, and that was not like some high praise. It was really a demeaning comment. So talk about both of those.
At the time, I didn't realize it. Goldman went from a private partnership to a public company in, I believe, 99, but right around that time. And I came over in 2003. So it was a fairly new, pretty important structural change that had happened a few years before. One of the things that was really fascinating is, whereas Instinet was a lot of creative thinkers, people that were, it was sort of David versus Goliath. You were going up against the, big players, and you were really trying to change the world. And I loved it. I completely drank the Kool-Aid and loved everything about it. And then you go into Goldman, which is, I was hired because I had a very specific skill set, not to sound like Liam Neeson, but I had a very specific skill set that was very narrow, and it was needed at the time. So I understood electronic trading market structure. I understood the systems and what was happening with the regulation and how the regulation was changing. And that's really why I was hired. When I came into Goldman, first of all, I had 13 interviews, which is crazy. It was, and most people that I talk to that I've said this to that have worked at Goldman, that's kind of norm. You have a lot of interviews, you're talking to a lot of people. And there are people you're talking to who are sort of giving you the what's the square root of pi question, which, and then there are people who are trying to converse and see how you're going to fit on the team. And so it's a really wide ranging group of folks that you interview with. I would say the biggest thing that surprised me, there were a couple of things, and one had to do with my particular role at the time. So Goldman Sachs had purchased Spear, Leeds & Kellogg, and which was another broker-dealer that had an electronic trading platform, and that's one of the reasons that they purchased this company. And the cultures between Spear, Leeds & Kellogg and Goldman could not have been more different. Spear, Leeds & Kellogg, very scrappy, very, aggressive group of people. And it built the firm from, a small firm to this, and it really done it through counter-positioning, building out a clearing business, building out a market making business, building out an electronic trading platform. They had done it through finding niches and really leaning into those niches in ways that others hadn't. And so it was fantastic and a very, very smart strategy. They were purchased by Goldman Sachs, and Goldman, very white shoe, very buttoned up, very, everyone went to an Ivy League school, and the cultures clashed quite a bit. And so when I first came in, I was really put into a lot of rooms as Switzerland. They wanted me to just try and negotiate and navigate between these two very different groups that needed to somehow come together and consolidate their operations, which also brought up the obvious issue that happens a lot whenever you're going through very large M&A transactions. The company that's been acquired, a lot of times they don't want to completely integrate, because once they completely integrate, they know they have job insecurity.
Right.
And until they completely integrate, they know that they've got some job security. And so it was a lot of trying to negotiate, trying to make things work between groups that did not, for various reasons, necessarily love coming together. And I think this is standard M&A,
Right.
agita that happens. But that was very interesting and very different. And yes, I wasn't one of the first, but it was unusual that I came in as what was called a lateral hire. Most people joined right after college, or they would join right after business school, and they would be from, the very elite schools. And it was a very coveted job to go into Goldman Sachs. And so I didn't realize for many years, but when people would say, oh, she's a lateral, I didn't realize that wasn't a good thing. And I don't think it was necessarily seen as a bad thing, but it was sort of almost just a descriptor that they would
Right.
put in there to just let everyone know that I hadn't gone to Harvard. I did go to Columbia for business school, but I hadn't gone to Harvard, and I wasn't sort of from that lineage. So it was fine. I had a really very interesting career there. I was actually also, one interesting thing about Goldman is, at the time, if you're not a producer and you're not an operator, they really don't know what to do with you. So because my job was very different, I was a chief of staff, a COO. Really, the organization didn't know what to do with me at a certain point after I had been there for several years. And so my boss said, you really should become a trader or a sales trader, which is not in my personality. But
Right.
I did. I became a sales trader for 3 years, the 3 fun years, 2005 to 2008. And so I was there during the subprime crisis. I was there. I also had my 2 sons at that time. I was there during the Lehman. So it was a really interesting experience, but it was not really something that, within a month, I knew that this isn't something that, it's very transactional. It's a very transactional business, as well as, it's kind of funny. It's transactional in that you come in and you make your calls, your outbound calls, and research calls in the morning, and then the phone rings, and you pick up the phone, you get the order, you work the trade. That's sort of how it works. At the end of the day, you go out to dinner 4 nights out of 5. You go out to dinner and you're, dining with clients, you're and then you're out, and then you come in at 6 a.m. the next day and repeat. And so it wasn't something that resonated with me. And in the way being a COO or building a business or, doing something completely disruptive resonated with me in my other roles. And so by 2010, I was offered a role at Deutsche Bank to be the COO for global electronic trading. And I took the opportunity and went over to Deutsche Bank, and it was a completely different culture. It was, whereas Goldman was very flat from a management perspective. There were very few partners. It was a very almost as a military, right? It was very flat. You knew where you were getting your orders from. You knew where you were getting your instructions from. At Deutsche Bank had grown through acquisition through the 90s and 2000s. And so it was this really collection of very different groups. And it was also because it was a German company. We were actually, the capital markets was really headquartered out of London, but it was a German bank. You had a lot of different bosses. So it was a matrix. So you had a regional boss and then you had a business boss. And there was one time that I think I had 8 bosses.
Wow.
Which is really fascinating because you're constantly trying to navigate, everyone's goals and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. So I definitely will say that made me realize flat organizations, there's a lot of power to flat organizations. I understand the need for a matrix, especially when you get up to a global level, that you need some folks that are responsible for countries and some folks that are responsible for businesses. But I do think it was overly complex and caused a lot of what I would call not necessarily breakage, but you would just spend a lot of time on things that weren't necessarily additive to the business or driving the business forward.
Yeah. And didn't you say also when we chatted that you also ran, it was like 2,000 systems?
Are you drowning in boring corporate communications? Palacio and Partners is here to rescue you. We transform internal podcasts from snooze fest to must-listen content that actually connects your team and strengthens your culture. Imagine podcast episodes that make your employees laugh while staying informed. Our founder, Jeff Palacio, doesn't just create podcasts, he creates conversations that break through the noise. Whether you're a growing startup or a massive corporation, we turn your company's story into audio gold. Leadership becomes human. Remote teams feel connected. Your message cuts through the clutter. Palacio and Partners, where corporate communications gets a fun makeover. Let's make your podcast work harder than your email inbox ever could. Jeff is happy to share his insights on podcasting with you. You can contact him via LinkedIn or schedule a Zoom call via the link in the episode description.
And didn't you say also when we chatted that you also ran, it was like 2,000 systems?
Yes. So one of the after effects of buying so many companies, they weren't necessarily integrated because they were trying to move very quickly and sort of establish a moat around their size. And they were very, very revenue focused, but not necessarily operationally focused at the time that I was there. And so when I got there, I was asked to kind of make sense of the technical footprint. I'm not a technologist, but I was the COO for electronic trading. So I, gave it a good go. And I mapped out, I think there were 2,000 or 2,500 systems within the equities division. So just within my division, there was this massive amount of technical infrastructure, architecture, and it was really challenging for the technology teams and operations teams to operate on a day-to-day basis because they were spending all of their time, turning on systems and, patching systems and making sure systems went. And so that's, to me, was really an interesting learning around when you're doing an acquisition, it's just as important as how are you going to integrate this thing? as it is purchasing the revenue or purchasing the team.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I worked at Sprint in the early days. It was about 18 months old, and it was a merger, three companies. It was like Southern Pacific Railroad. That was the SP in Sprint. It was GTE and United Telecom. And so I'm in this room, not that big. There were 6 desks. I had one, and we were all like right next to each other. And it was 5 Arthur Anderson, which became Accenture. But it was me, and my job was to inventory and name and what they did, all the systems. Like, so at one point at like 28 years old, like I knew more about all the systems than anyone at Sprint, because no one had done the cataloging and what they did and what each, who owned it, like which company. I mean, it was crazy. And I had come from AT&T. It was the largest company in the world when I joined, and then, the divestiture happened, but still it was a big company. So it was just, mind-boggling to me. So not that it was 2,500 systems, but I kind of get the gist of, that's crazy. And that was only, like you said, under your division, the equity markets. I'm like, wow.
Exactly. Yeah, it was fascinating.
So you're there. I mean, you have your COO, and what led you to kind of say, I've had enough? And
it was 2015, 2016, and the market was really going more, especially public equities. So I was in the equities division. I was the COO for global equity trading, and equities as an asset class was getting very much more defensive, meaning, all of the banks were defending their share of the wallet, or, each client, it wasn't growing. So you were constantly just trying to maintain year over year that revenue stream. And commissions were starting to compress. We had already gone through the phase, in the earlier 2000s, where desks had consolidated. They were looking to consolidate more. And I just thought, I've got another few decades in me, and this really isn't going to be the growth area in, a few years. So I looked around and looked at private markets. And back then in 2015, a lot of people, one thing that's interesting about finance is when you're in finance, or usually when you're in finance, you're very narrow and very deep. So you're an equity swaps sales trader, and you know that very, very well. But if you're a foreign exchange trader, you don't know what the equity swaps person's doing, and the equity swaps person doesn't know what the foreign exchange person is doing, much less if you go to the banking side of the world, of the building. You really don't know what the jobs are. Maybe when you're an intern, you're rotating through them, but you go very deep and very, very specialized. One of the interesting effects of that is people don't know. So when you go from public markets to private markets, it really took me a number of years to understand the differences between the two markets. Private markets were massive, are getting more massive, but they really didn't have a lot of technology or infrastructure around them. If you wanted to have any type of exposure, if you wanted to invest in something that wasn't on the public stock exchange, you would invest in it through a fund, or in that fund would be either a venture capital or a private equity fund. But there weren't ways for everyday people to say, I really like X, Y, and Z. I really love this band. You can buy a T-shirt, you can buy a poster, but you can't buy the royalty stream of their songs. And I thought that's a really interesting place where not only can you open up access, so make it more available, and there were market structure changes going on at the time too. Something called the Jobs Act was passed in 2010, and that really cracked the door open for this. But you weren't really able to invest in these things and be able to have them as part of your portfolio. I mean, people, for those that know, it used to be called the 60-40 portfolio. So 60% stocks, 40% bonds. But really, you don't talk about there being some type of private market. And people might call that alternatives. They might call that private markets. But whatever they call that, it wasn't really available to the everyday person. And it certainly wasn't available in what I consider to be compelling areas that people feel that their values are aligned with, or they really, really are passionate about. That certainly wasn't something that was available to them within a regulated, wrapper. And so that's why I decided to leave. I left in 2016, and I co-founded Rialto Markets with two co-founders. And we really embarked on this journey and spent a lot of time understanding private markets, a lot of time, working with issuers, working with investors, and a lot of time with regulators.
About 2 years into this journey, I think a sale was about to happen. So you're like, oh man, this is easy. Talk about that whole experience.
Yeah, it was. I mean, for our startup founders, one thing that was most interesting in terms of moving from a very corporate world to a startup world is they're very different muscles. And being a COO, I felt that I knew enough about the different disciplines within a business to be dangerous enough to be able to figure it out. However, the skill set in having a startup, once you sort of leave that business card behind of a big established brand, there is a big change that goes on. And so I'll first say that's something that is real, and you need to be prepared for that. And I've seen this time and time again over the last 10 years. Someone will be at Apollo or Goldman or wherever, and they'll think that, oh, I'm gonna start this new company, and they go and they hang out their own shingle, and they don't understand why no one's returning their phone calls. It's the platform, right? You're part of this big platform, and that should not be underestimated, the platform that you're a part of. When we were purchased, so we went through an initial sale back in 2018. There was a big boom in ICOs, initial coin offerings. So this was kind of the cryptocurrency wave one back in 2017, 2018. But what a lot of people wanted is they really wanted a place that where they could secondarily trade. And they wanted to be regulated. And Rialto was one of, I think it was about 55 back then, alternative trading systems. So I was getting a lot of calls from cryptocurrency exchanges all over the world. And I really didn't give it much validity until I received a call from a banker. And so we entered into a negotiation and entered into a sale. And the learning really from that was, one, the market wasn't there. At the time, the regulatory environment, the SEC was still trying to get their head around, what this meant. There's a lot of technical detail that people have a hard time sort of wrapping their head around. And when you put it in a regulated environment, it's very, very challenging. And I mean, to I don't want to say to defend, but to the SEC's credit, they don't get paid to say yes. They get blamed
Right.
when something goes wrong, right? So they need to be conservative and understand what they're getting into. And so after we sold, we really went through a very long and very painful process of working with, convincing the SEC around our application to introduce something called digital securities, which are blockchain-based securities, and now they're called tokenized securities. What that would allow us to do are a lot of things. I mean, one, you see them most prevalently probably in people being able to trade U.S. public stocks on other exchanges. What I find most interesting is being able to, fractionalize private market investments and make those available so that people can invest in a lot of different things in a very easy way. And why do you need something like this? Because if I were to have a $5 million investment or $20 million investment, and I were to raise from a very large group of people and 100,000 people came in, that would be a very expensive thing to both process, right, under a regulated wrapper, both doing all of the checks that you need to do as a registered broker-dealer, but also to collect the money and to process the money. And then if there are any dividends or anything like that are supposed to go to the investors, to process all of those corporate actions. Those things are very expensive unless you've got it digitized in a way or scalable. And we really felt that digital securities were a good implementation and a good way to take what we already had built in the US capital market structure for private markets. That's where we went with that. Unfortunately, as it relates to the combination, the fact that it took us 2 years to expand our license into digital securities, the purchaser really soured on the U.S. market and actually exited the U.S. market completely. And so we needed to, find another option. Unfortunately, we had grown the team to be quite large, not quite large, 10. So beyond the founders, we had grown the team beyond the founders as we were building out this business. And so we needed to quite quickly, one, find product market fit, but two, figure out how to get to a more sustainable business model without sort of that cover of a very large company, covering your operating expenses. We very quickly went from sort of being this R&D group where, all the expenses were covered and it was okay, this is a new business and you've got some latitude, to you're on your own, you have to pay the monthly rent. And that happened, pretty much overnight, which was challenging and really hard to navigate, but we did navigate it and got to the other side of it.
I'm going to get back to that, but I want to go back to the early days. I think you said something I wrote down when we first met. When you in the early days of Rialto, you said you had to burn the boats and shed the old skin. So, what was the hardest, kind of large corporation, corporate skin you had hardest to shed?
There are some physical things. You're not going to a physical big office. You're working from your kitchen counter, and that's interesting. That's it. That you're having meetings in the lobby.
Pre-COVID.
Exactly. And pre-COVID, you're right. Now that's not necessarily a challenging thing, but I did, used to have this big office. I used to have a routine, every day would come in, would, have a very, very much a routine. I also, we had a lot of help because I worked and my husband worked and we had to give up all of that. And so I was spending a lot of time doing things that I hadn't done before. And that was, all of those things were very challenging. And I was pretty hard on myself, actually, in terms of saying, well, I'm spending all of this time, I'm only spending 10 or 12 hours a day on the business. I used to spend 16 hours a day when it was crunch time working. I need to be spending, and that wasn't even my company. That was another company, spending 16 hours a day on this thing. And I'll never forget my husband saying, yeah, but you're cooking every meal, you're picking up the kids, you're cleaning the house, you're doing all of these other things you didn't necessarily do when you were working those very long hours or traveling, as much as you used to do. And so that was a really big learning, as well as probably the biggest thing is the burning the boat. When I first quit, I definitely kept in touch with everyone I used to work with. A part of it was because, we had established relationships over 5, 10 years. But it was also sort of in the back of my mind, if this doesn't work out, I can go back. I can go back, whether it's to there, or I can go back to another similar firm, and need to keep up the network, and I need to keep up those conversations. And I finally realized one day it was holding me back because I was split in terms of my identity. I wasn't fully in. I didn't have both feet in this new path. And, I had this sort of refuge where I would go back and, you'd hear all the latest that was going on with the old company or your old colleagues. And I really had to make a clean break. And I did. I stopped contacting everyone I used to work with. I made a clean break, and I one day just woke up and said, this is what I'm doing. And until I have to do something else, until I have to reevaluate it, I'm not looking back. I'm not looking for a job at another big corporation. I'm not going to take those headhunter calls, and I'm just going to focus on making this successful. But it is a big shift.
You also talked about some things you learned during the merger and acquisition process. I think you involved in a little bit of litigation at Rialto. So would you like to talk more about that?
Yeah, No, but I will. It's painful. I mean, and my one piece of advice, and I don't think this is going to be astonishing, is, avoid it at all costs because it is expensive, it's time consuming, it's draining, it's emotionally draining, and it really does have an impact on you. So to the extent that you can avoid litigation, I would highly recommend it. I would not go into it unless you really have looked at all the options and there aren't other options, even a little bit worse options. We tried to avoid it, and it really wasn't until we realized there was no other way. And then at that point, we went full force. And by meaning full force, got the best litigator we could. And really, it was a year and a half of my life where, and other people on the team's lives, where we were very focused on getting the best outcome for Rialto. It's challenging because when you go into new partnerships, I think when you're starting anything and you get any type of response or resonance, I'm an optimist, so I always think glass half full, right? And I think whenever you get the resonance from someone else, or someone starts nodding, or someone says, "Oh, I love this partnership, will be great." I think from my perspective and as a human, I always just want to agree and say, "This is great. Okay, we're going to do this together. This is going to be fantastic." And it's only been over the last 5 years that I've really started qualifying opportunities a lot more in a different way, because I've had so many people that have these great ideas or great thoughts, and either they're not the right partner, or they don't have the money, or they're not aligned with where we want to go. And it's really hard, because when I was getting advice many years ago, people would always say, "Don't take any money, make sure it's the right money that you're taking." When I would hear that advice, I would just stiffen, because I would say, "Well, it's easy for you to say. You don't have to make payroll. You don't have to keep the lights on. It's easy when you're sort of sitting in the cheap seats, or not in the middle of the ring going through this." I do say there's a lot of validity to that, because taking the wrong money can be expensive, and can really take your eye off the ball for a very long time, and can be catastrophic, existential from that perspective. Because when you are a startup, the benefit you have is you can move very quickly, you can do different things, and you can kind of find your product market fit quickly, and you're very nimble. But you don't have much money, and you have limited resources, and one of those limited resources is time. And so being consumed by a bad investor, or some type of litigation can be deadly to a company.
Yeah, and I think you said the employees own a certain percentage of Rialto, because you didn't take a bunch of VC money. But has that been the harder path? But I mean, the path you took, I mean, having the employees invest, has that preserved the kind of the soul, the culture of the company more?
I think it definitely has. Obviously, I would have loved for a VC. Well, back then, I will say, when I first started out, I would have loved to have had a VC, put a $1, $5, $10, $20 million check. And as I look at the landscape of at least our world, we're in a very specific niche of the market, but our landscape, it's somewhat astonishing. I mean, from billions of dollars to hundreds of millions of dollars to, probably one of our nearest competitors has raised $90 million. And we're sitting at about 23. And that's all from really angels, small investors, and founders. And so we really didn't take the easy path in terms of sort of getting a big check and being on our way. But what it has preserved is it's really allowed us to take the opportunities that we feel strongest about, and that we're seeing move forward with those, and not necessarily have an investor say, "Well, I want you over here working on my thing," or saying, "You know what, your time's up. This didn't work out. It didn't work out in the time frame that we thought, so we're shutting the whole thing down." I think,
Right.
especially in our world where it's taken 10 years to play out, having what I'll call non-traditional investment coming into the company has allowed us to be able to wait out the timing that a lot of other firms didn't have the luxury of doing. So that's been on our side.
I don't think I've ever asked this question before, but it makes me think like, if you stayed at, large companies, the Goldmans, the Deutsche Banks, what part of your personal evolution or maybe your definition of success would have never happened if you didn't go and start Rialto Markets?
That's easy. It was impact. I mean, one of the biggest reasons I left Deutsche Bank was not just the macro trends, but it was, you come in and you're working at this massive company and your impact is small. And so, what needle you're moving is for me personally was quite small. And the impact that I can have now at Rialto Markets, we've done so many different raises. We've helped so many different companies raise from their community base. And we've really been able to work with companies on being able to change how capital is formed. And to me, that's such in pick your number of years, we're going to look back on this time and say the world is completely different. And the capital, the way that people can form capital, the way that people can invest has completely changed. And that's what's most exciting from my perspective. And I definitely wouldn't have had the ability to be involved at the level that I'm involved in it if I had stayed at a big company.
Through everything you've worked through, the corporate complexity everywhere, the Rialto, the kind of founder chaos, the litigation, raising capital, market transformation. What has that taught you, Shari, about trusting yourself?
Oh, well, I would say it's taught me the mantra of pack light and move fast. Mm-hmm. I definitely trust my gut in ways that I never would have before 10 years ago, but also it's much more natural for me to be constantly running simulations or, cost benefit analysis or potentialities and much more quickly say, okay, this isn't working. We're done. We're moving over here. And being comfortable doing that, being comfortable making that call and saying, we might find out that moving over here wasn't the right move, but we can always adjust. And I think a lot of people get caught in analysis paralysis where they're so nervous to either make a call or to commit to something. And that's a skill that I've definitely not just developed, but sharpened in the last 10 years.
I love helping two groups of people. So if you were to go back, so let's pretend you're now 22, 23 years old, you graduate from Marquette. What advice would you give yourself in 2026 at that age to find their first job and begin their corporate career?
I would say, just try something, do something, because even if it's not the perfect job, the best job, now. I remember when I was in college, I took a job at microfiching in the basement of a insurance company. It was the most miserable job I ever had in my life. I did it for 3 months. It was a temp, job, and I did it for 3 months, and it was a miserable job. But while I was doing that job, all I could think was, this is fantastic because this will be the worst job I've ever had. Right. And now I can check that off. I can say, check. Like, that's the worst job I've ever had. It was sort of, I don't know if you ever saw Joe versus the Volcano, the lights, the fluorescent lights, and you're in the basement, and it rows and rows of people just with these microfichures. Most people listening to this probably don't even know what a microfiche is.
Right. I was going to say, I do, unfortunately.
But so it was, I think if you're graduating, today, there is a lot of angst, just in the general thought body around us about people coming into the workforce today. And so what I would say is, try something and dive in. And for example, my son getting a summer job, he wasn't able to get a summer job, so he's doing AI classes and he's coding. And so just do something to create skills. And that might end up on you betting on yourself more and finding your path more. When I graduated from college, I really wanted to go to a big company because I wanted the training program that was available in a big company. But one interesting thing that I've noticed is today you can get the same virtual training online. You can really curate your own experience.
You really can.
So pick a lane, pick something that that you feel. I won't say necessarily that you feel passionate about. I think it's something that you feel passionate about, that you can make money, that you're good at, right? That Venn diagram. But pick something there and just start doing it today. Yeah. And then you'll learn. You'll learn if you like it, but don't waste a day thinking and there's always benefits to organizing and getting organized and staying organized. But I also think sometimes we spend too much time shuffling papers and making sure everything's exactly perfect. There's no perfect day. Today is the perfect day.
Yeah, I like your glass half full when you're doing the microfiche job. Like, this is the worst job I'm ever going to have, so I'm good. I'm checking it off. I'm done. The second group is the ones that want to take a different leadership journey from an IC, individual contributor, to a manager, first-time manager. As they take that jump, what advice would you give them as they begin that leadership journey?
I think managing people, the biggest piece of advice that I've had is to realize everyone's going through their own journey. And a lot of times we get caught on, metrics and KPIs and trying to exceed or excel at those KPIs, but realize everyone's going through their own journey. And the most success I've ever had is really talking to the folks, whether I'm managing them or working with them, and saying, what do you want to get out of this? And making it much more collaborative. Now, there's always, you need to make sure, some people would say I'm too collaborative, because I really do think that you get so much more when you work in a collaboration rather than just giving tasks. I also think there's nothing I will ever assign or give to a direct report that I haven't done myself or that I wouldn't do myself. So I'm never going to ask someone to do something that I haven't done. And that's just my own personal leadership style. I feel that, I shouldn't be asking someone to do that. And also to understand that while I may be working 12 hours a day, that doesn't need to be the norm. And if I'm sending emails at 2:00 in the morning, what kind of signal is that sending? So a lot of times I, have a raft of emails that go out at 8 in the morning. But I think in general, when you're managing other people, it's interesting because you're trying to get a productivity output out. What you're there for, right, is to make sure that you're moving forward in terms of the organization. But sometimes people get a little too focused on the metrics. I often lean into more of the relationship side of things and being generally curious about how people are approaching things, because the biggest thing I've learned is my mind works in a very different way than everyone else on the team's mind works. If you can harness all of those differences of opinion and take the best of them, you're going to be so much more powerful than if you just take your own brain and move forward with just your brain's knowledge and guidance.
I love the curiosity part of that too. I think it's just so key. Shari, thanks so much for coming on the Corporate Couch. I'm so grateful we got introduced, and you're a great guest. So thank you. I loved hearing your story.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
So fun to talk with Shari. I mean, grateful that my friend Jeff Cerise, who Susan, his wife, works for Shari's company, introduced us. But so many great stories. Going 2 semesters to Poland in college, I believe, after the Berlin Wall, opening up the first telecom company, cellular, in Poland. $2,500 cell phone charge to buy one, 50 cents a minute. Then I don't know if you remember the random landlady. It was hard. She was a single female. It's hard to get a apartment, and she would come home from work. And the landlady would be in her flat, I guess we would call it in Europe.
Yeah.
Really, she was an accounting major. I think she went to Marquette. And the accounting professor said, look, you need to be a communications major. Accounting's not for you. So she did graduate with an accounting major because she said two things. One, I can get a job, and I wanted to show this guy that I could be a good accounting major.
And don't you think that was a little bit of a slight to communications majors? It's like,
right.
Oh,
you can't be accounting.
You can't be an accounting major. You should just be a communications major. Right. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, it's funny. But you know what? But I look at her, kind of her career arc, and it was, it's like trusting. The theme I looked at is like trusting yourself in messy rooms, right? So she went to, the working on Wall Street, Goldman Sachs. The lessons she learned with Goldman Sachs in terms of 13 interviews to get the job. She was labeled as a lateral from her previous company coming over, which is not a, badge of honor, as a badge of dishonor there.
Yeah. And that 13 interviews was a standard, was a norm.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I thought she was going to say that it was so unusual or something. No, that's just how they hire people.
And then she became Switzerland in terms of between Goldman and the company they acquired. And, because she was just so good at, kind of the people part of it. And the lesson she talked about, and we've heard this with multiple guests, is acquisition deals close on paper, but the culture fit determines whether they actually work. And you and I went through that at Boehringer Ingelheim. We acquired Fort Dodge Animal Health it was about 8 weeks after I started. You came on a little after the acquisition in December of that year. But it was the reason it worked is that you didn't know if somebody, because we were both new, you didn't know if somebody worked for Fort Dodge or Boehringer because the people were very similar. The culture.
I had no choice but to treat everybody equally.
Right. But
it was only looking back over my shoulder that I realized, I remember this so-and-so meeting, and some of the people on this side of the table were not agreeing with the people on that side of the table. And now that I got this big picture, I realized, that's because you're from that company and you're from this company.
Yeah, but the cultures, I think, were very similar. That's why it
they
worked.
They were similar, but it wasn't automatic. It took a while to assimilate everybody.
And speaking of German companies, so she goes from Goldman to Deutsche Bank.
Yeah.
Which was, Goldman was a flat organization. She goes to Deutsche Bank, and the complexity of that, she had 8 bosses, thousands of systems she was dealing with, right?
I have 8 bosses, Bob. 8. Sound familiar?
Yeah, I mean, it was just how she kind of embraced that, learning all the systems, and it shows how complexity in a system, in an organization, and this was just one division of Deutsche Bank, but it quietly kills productivity, right? Because you're constantly dealing, like, one boss is hard enough. You have 1 + 7, and then getting through thousands of systems is nuts. Like, when you're and she was a pioneer in that kind of equity trading space, and then pivots to being a co-founder of Rialto Markets. And all the lessons there, leaving the big company platform, being the founder, the whole litigation shit she went through was crazy. Learning not to take the wrong money. She didn't want investors she learned all these lessons the hard way. But she basically went from prestige to impact, right? I don't know. What was your take on that, Joe?
No, I saw the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, she didn't say it in this way, but this is the way I always look at it. Do you want to be a small fish in a big pond or a big fish in a small pond? And the important thing is it doesn't really matter. One isn't any better or worse than the other. What's important is that you understand it and that you're comfortable with whichever one that you're in. First of all, you need to know which one you're in, and then you need to understand that you're okay with whichever one you're in. She decided that she needed to be a big fish in a small pond because when she was a small fish, she emphasized on the small fish part of it. That is, she felt like she had no impact. And that's actually the word that she used was,
Right.
I felt like I was in this great big organization with zero impact. I could do something, and at the end of the day, it wouldn't matter anything to the bottom line of the big corporation. I turned out that I wanted to be the exact opposite. I wanted to be a small fish in a big pond, because the big pond offered me the best opportunities for myself, best training, the
Yeah.
best tools, the best
Yeah.
toys to work with, frankly,
Yeah.
as a business analyst.
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
could read about a software analysis product in a magazine, and I could go to my boss and we'd get it. You
Yeah.
know, as because we were or maybe we already had it. We probably already had it somewhere, and we just had to find out
Right.
how to get it myself.
Yeah, and to be clear, I know you know this, but when we say she was a small fish, she was a COO and she had
Well,
big roles. But yes,
yeah,
but it's you're buried in a company of 60,000 employees or whatever it is, and
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah. When you're in that big of an organization, it's very hard for any one individual to do very much of anything.
yeah, no, totally agree, totally
And
agree.
so that was great. I just loved the interview, though. It was a delight to listen to. She seems like a delightful person, and loved it, and had a good time with it. Appreciated the opportunity to sit in on it with you.
Joe, we're recording this 2 days before the U.S. of A's 250th birthday. I have my brother-in-law and sister-in-law coming to spend some time with us for the holiday. I'm going to need I need some laughter. Make
Then
me laugh.
you need to know how to tell an underwear joke,
I do.
because
Okay.
because here's what you have to do. You could tell a long joke about underwear, but it's better to be brief.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Corporate Couch. If you enjoy the podcast, I would love for you to take 2 minutes out of your day to rate us 5 stars and write a review. Please join me next week to learn from another great leader sharing their professional journey and insights.